Mm-hmm.
Not working.
Hi, everyone, and good evening, and welcome to Barbara's Bookstore, a great Chicago bookstore tradition, really the oldest independent bookstore in the Chicago area. So thanks to Barbara for hosting tonight's session with author Bijal Trivedi. My name is Preston Campbell, and it's my honor to moderate tonight. Bijal, big congratulations on your first book, Breath from Salt.
Yeah, thank you so much.
It beautifully tells the story of cystic fibrosis, and I'll occasionally say CF. So those that are listening, CF and cystic fibrosis are the same. And really, it's a story about a community that dared to dream to change the lives of those with cystic fibrosis forever. So I can't wait to jump into the book, but I really think that first, probably some of our listeners would like to learn a little bit more about you. Are you willing to do that?
I think we can start there. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm going to start at the beginning and give you the light speed version. So I was born in England, grew up in Australia, and moved here just before college. And in college, I studied biochemistry. And then after that, I went and got a dose of real life lab work. So I went to the Whitehead Institute in Cambridge, where I learned what it took to find a gene. And these were the early primitive days of gene hunting. So it was very difficult. And so I did that for 2 years. And then I went to graduate school to study cell, molecular, and developmental biology. So I was in a PhD program and headed towards becoming a scientist. And then I switched to science journalism.
So why the switch? You had trained for a long time as a scientist. Something pulled you into writing. What was it that pulled you into writing?
It was a little bit bizarre. I enjoyed giving talks at grad school about scientific subjects or journal articles I had read. But then one day, and I'm going to date myself by saying this, I read this article about how Dolly the sheep was cloned. And it was such an exciting story. And, the story, the backstory of the researchers, it just captivated me. And given my love for science, and not just biology, but, I'm also a bit of a space astronomy nerd. I thought it would be great to write about science and explain the science to a lay audience, just as I had, appreciated in this article. And then one of my friends convinced me to apply to science journalism school at NYU, which I did, and sort of the rest is history.
Well, your writing career is obviously working out. I have to hold up your book, Breath from Salt. The reviews have been outstanding. Congratulations. And I think it's really cool that Bill Gates has said that it's one of four books that people should read during the pandemic. What do you think about that?
Well, I'd be lying if I didn't think that was super cool. I mean, it is Bill Gates, and he knows so much about science and medicine. So yeah, I did a happy dance when I read that. I was thrilled.
So tell me
a lot.
Well, you should be excited, and well-deserved, by the way. So I'm not surprised. You are not affected in any way, if I remember correctly, by cystic fibrosis.
That's right.
How were you drawn into the cystic fibrosis story?
Well, it began way back in 2012. An editor at Discover magazine suggested that I look into a story on a drug called Kalydeco, which as you well know, was the first drug approved for the treatment of cystic fibrosis, but not all patients, just 4% of cystic fibrosis patients. And she said, why don't you look into it? And I just thought that was really, really strange. Like, why would a pharmaceutical company go after a rare disease for a start, and then not, and then just treat a tiny portion of this population? I mean, what would be the point? And how could anybody make money doing that? And so, I thought, all right, I'll look into this. And I started to meet amazing people as I was investigating this magazine story. I met parents, I met CEOs, I met philanthropists, I met scientists and physicians. And the story was so exciting that after writing a 10-page story for Discover magazine, um, I hadn't scratched the surface of this story. It was exciting. It was amazing. The people's determination was it was mind blowing. So that was the point where I thought, okay, if it's not even scratching the surface after 10 pages, then I should write a book. And I'd never written a book before, so it was slightly scary to embark on that, but I was riveted. I was absolutely riveted.
Well, I'm so thankful that you did. I'm stunned by the fact that you said that it was probably a little difficult. How many years did it take you to compile the data and write Breath from Salt? Because, if we just start, it's 60 plus years since one beginning, and there are multiple beginnings of this story. And you did such a beautiful job of sort of capturing details that I didn't know existed. So how long did it take, and how did you do that?
Well, I started with that Discover article and interviewing people and reporting that story. And then, I had to learn how to write a book proposal. I had to get an agent, all those things that happen seamlessly in the movies. I had to sort of learn how to do from scratch. Getting the agent was not glamorous as I thought it would be. But from 2012 to about 2016, all I was doing was reporting and interviewing. And it was only, in the middle of 2016 that I actually started writing. And the crazy thing was, as I was writing, more and more treatments were being developed, and the science was moving so fast that my publisher gave me more time, because I said, they're nearly there. They're going to come up with another drug. And I kept saying this. I mean, they thought I was crazy at some point. But, the science was so exciting that I just kept pushing my book deadline until, there was a finale of sorts in 2019. So a lot of reporting.
A lot of work, good for you, and I'm so thankful you did. A lot of scientific and medical leaders will tell you that the story of cystic fibrosis is the most amazing story in medicine today, and I believe that. It is, quite frankly, stunning. But a lot of people who are listening are neither scientists or in the field of medicine. Is this a book just about science and medicine, or why should they be interested in this book as well?
Well, it's kind of funny that you asked that, because what hooked me on this story, as much of a science nerd and a biochem nerd that I am, it was the people that really inspired me to write this book. And it was, the science is incredible. It's path-breaking. It's, breakthrough medicines. But, it was really the human stories that propelled me to write this book. It was the story of these parents who, even though they had lost children, they had a commitment to solving and curing this disease. The scientists who were involved were, the most bullheaded people I'd ever met. And they were just, not going to give up. The people that, were part of the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation that figured out how to fund and drive all this science. I mean, that they were another breed altogether. And it's learning their personal motivations and their personal stories that really drove the book, and the writing. Because I think, if it weren't for all these amazing human stories, I don't think I would have done this. I don't think I would have written this book. But, weaving the stories of patients and parents and the stories of the physicians, including Preston here, without those amazing stories, this book wouldn't have held together. And so that's the glue here. That's the reason to read it. And it's inspiring. It's these people who went up against all odds, and, at a time where there was no hope of finding a cure or a treatment for their sick children. And they didn't get perturbed. They got upset and they did something, and they all came together. And, my mind continues to be blown by that. So that's really what drove me to write the book. It was the people behind the science and the philanthropy, the parents, the patients. That was the inspiration.
It is inspiring. The number of heroes, there's so many heroes in this story. It's quite remarkable. So, we're probably at a point that we should explain what cystic fibrosis is. A lot of people may be listening and not know what cystic fibrosis is. Do you want to have a stab at that?
Sure. And keep in mind, everybody, that Preston is the expert here, having had,
you're the expert. Bijal, you are
having
the expert.
run the CF Care Center at Vanderbilt for quite a while before he came to the foundation. But in simple terms, in layman's terms, this is a very rare, inherited, fatal genetic disease. And it's caused by a mutation in one gene in the whole genome. And this mutation changes the characteristic of pretty much every cell in the body. And it warps its function. And as a result, the lungs get filled with mucus. The pancreas doesn't work well. The liver doesn't work well. Children cannot absorb nutrients from their food, so they suffer from malnutrition. The skin is salty. Their sweat is hypersalty. But what is actually the most deadly part of this disease is because the mucus in their lungs is so thick, they can't cough it out. And then bacteria and viruses go into that mucus. They thrive and they destroy the lung tissue. And basically, it sort of deprives the person of breath. So that's why it's a truly horrible disease. And when it was first discovered in 1938, there was pretty much no hope, and children died around, before they reached their first birthday.
Well, let's jump into the story. Very early in the book, Breath from Salt, you talked about people being the heroes. You introduced us to a remarkable family, Joe and Kathy O'Donnell. And they had a son named Joey. And their story bridges the time of no hope in cystic fibrosis to where hope abounds. It introduces to Joe and Kathy and Kate and Casey and their story, because they come back and forth into the story. And I think such a wonderful family introduced us to the O'Donnells.
So it was when I met the O'Donnells that I actually decided to write this book. Joe is a very well-known businessman in the Boston area. He's like a Boston legend, and everybody in the city knows him. And I met with Joe and Kathy for the Discover story, and I didn't think I would have much in common with them, but we sat down all together, the three of us, in his conference room that had a gorgeous view of the Charles River, and it was an executive conference room. I'd never been in one of those before. And we started to talk about their son, Joey, who was born with cystic fibrosis at, in the dark ages of cystic fibrosis in 1974. And, they were pretty much told not to get attached to him. That's what the medical profession told them. They said, he's not going to survive, and don't get too attached. But against all odds, and with amazing medical treatment available at the time, and a passionate physician named Dr. Alan Lapie, who is just a lovely man, lovely pediatrician. And because Joe and Kathy were just so adamant about giving their child the best chance possible, they eluded the odds for 12 and a half years. And Joey lived way longer than anybody expected. And he was just a beautiful little boy, full of verve and fire, and, but he had terrible lungs. And that's unfortunately what got him. But what inspired me about their story, I mean, if that had happened to me, and I'm a mother of two children, the fact that they didn't throw, the disease aside and say, we don't want anything to do with this disease. This disease stole from us. It took our child. The fact that they didn't just abandon the disease and the community, and instead they doubled down. And not only did not they stay with the community, but Joe became a mega fundraiser for the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. And he raised, over the span of a decade and a bit, he raised $250 million. That's billion, B. $250 million. And this money was given to the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, and the foundation used that to fund new early research that eventually led to treatments for the disease, for, say, 90% of people with the disease. So they're this unbelievable couple, and it's taught me the power of tolerance and perseverance, and they're amazing. I'm big fans. I'm a big fan, as you can tell.
Well, you should be. They're good friends. I know they're good friends of yours as well. But they are people who, as I said earlier, dared to dream and make a difference, not only for their son Joey while he was alive, but then for people living today with cystic fibrosis. CF has to start somewhere. Children had been dying with CF for centuries before it was recognized as a unique medical condition. And that was done by a pretty remarkable person, Dr. Dorothy Anderson. As you mentioned earlier, in 1938, she wrote the paper. She really sort of led the way in many ways for women in medicine, as well as I didn't know a lot about her. I loved the way you brought her to life. Can you tell the people who are listening just a little bit about Dorothy? She's quite a remarkable lady.
Yeah, actually, Breath from Salt is filled with a lot of power women, starting with Kathy O'Donnell, and power chemists, power physicians, power scientists, go women. I mean, this is a real feminist book. But Dorothy Anderson in 1938 was a terrible time for a woman to be a physician, because the medical profession basically discouraged patients from seeing women physicians unless it was baby related or hygiene in the home. So a woman physician could tell you how to cook without contaminating your food. I mean, that's how they were treated. So they were really handicapped. And so Dorothy Anderson, she had an MD, couldn't really use it. So she was still very determined to have a career in medicine. So she went and got a PhD in pathology and started doing autopsies in the basement of what is now Columbia University, in one of the hospitals there. And it's there that she actually, she was doing an autopsy on a child that had supposedly died of celiac disease. And as she was going through the autopsy, she started to find irregularities that suggested to her that, this wasn't celiac disease. And she was a really tough lady. Like she never got married. She wore her hair in a bun, really tight bun. She did carpentry. She had a place in New York State, in the mountains, and built her cabin. So she was a forceful lady, and she was the first one to describe this disease, and sort of lay the foundation for CF research.
Well, she was one of many, and she is a remarkable lady. And then the CF Foundation started. And I love how you brought that to life. The CF Foundation, for those who don't know, is the nonprofit organization whose mission is to basically cure cystic fibrosis, and has been a driver with the CF community since 1955. But it was started, as you alluded to earlier, when there was nothing. Really nothing. There weren't any CF doctors. There weren't any CF clinics. There certainly wasn't any science. There were no medicines, and children were dying before they entered school. And I guess worse than anything else, there was no hope at all. So these brave souls decided to do something about that. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it was a set of 4 parents, and their children, 3 of them had a child with CF, and one had, friends whose child had CF, and they had nothing. So basically, it was 4 sets of parents. They convened at a meeting in Philadelphia, and this effort was led by Milton Graub, who was a pediatrician, and his wife, Evelyn Graub. And they basically convened and said, we have to do something about this. There's nothing for our children. We don't know who has it. We don't know how many people suffer from this disease. And this is 1955. And so they started making, they started to start up local groups in different regions. And Milton and Evelyn Graub, and I find this amazing. This is pre-internet, way pre-internet. And so every time they heard about a new family with a child who'd been just diagnosed with the disease, they drove to that person's house, that family's house, and they told them as much as they knew about cystic fibrosis and said, we need to all band together to defeat this disease. So just 4 sets of parents, bravely starting out, trying to rally support. I mean, they didn't know about the disease. They didn't have money. Nobody had heard of this thing, cystic fibrosis, so, and during the war, during World War II, there were people who were diagnosed with cystic fibrosis, and the Army said, well, we've never heard of this disease before, so, it doesn't exist. So they had to start up from the, ground up, educating physicians, educating the public, educating Congress. And that's where they started, 4 couples in a living room in Philly.
And when did Doris Tolson?
Another power woman. So Doris Tolson, who would eventually become president of the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation in the 1970s, she had a daughter who had CF, and she came from a pretty well-to-do family, and she had a real talent for fundraising. And in the beginning, she just wanted to help raise awareness about CF. But then one thing that Doris understood really early on was that to get anywhere with this disease, and to get anywhere with any disease, you need money. Once you have money, you can hire scientists, you can do the research, and research will lead to a treatment. So Doris Tolson knew that the key to this disease was raising money. Once you had the money, you could start to learn about the disease, the cause of the disease, and then how to treat it. So she was a fundraiser extraordinaire, and this was sort of a generation before Joe O'Donnell. So she started with the fundraising, and she started figuring out, how much you could raise and what that money could do in terms of research.
I'm pretty sure Doris called Joe O'Donnell. Joey was diagnosed, if I remember that correctly. So the foundation was started by these really visionary individuals. They had to start somewhere. Where did they start? What did they do first?
One of the first things they did, and this is actually pretty extraordinary because it has repercussions for the current ongoing science, is they realized that nothing was known about their disease. So they started up a series of care centers around the US. And the point of these care centers they were specialized centers for children with cystic fibrosis. And basically, that's all they were for. These centers were to specialize in this disease, collect data, learn about the disease, store the data in a registry, which they started up pretty soon afterwards, and sort of, try and squeeze every bit of knowledge out of the patients that they could, so that they could figure out, what's the best treatment, what might be the cause, what's the range of symptoms, because with cystic fibrosis, there is a very broad spectrum of symptoms. You may see one symptom in one patient and another in another patient. And, that's something that Preston knows a lot about. And so it was a huge information gathering exercise in the beginning with these care centers, but they were also assured good treatment for their children. And the physicians at those care centers became real specialists, and they became sort of the foundation of the CF medical profession. So that was, the first enormous step that they took. And then when Doris Tolson came in addition to fundraising, she hired the medical and scientific director named Bob Bell, and he would later become a CEO for the foundation.
So
And
let's jump to that in
okay.
1 second.
Okay.
So I just want to make the point, because I think there's a theme. Doris was amazing, just amazing, but she understood the value of science and the data that would characterize cystic fibrosis, the changing epidemiology of cystic fibrosis. And that's something that's being bannered around today as almost an anti-science, particularly in the COVID pandemic. And so I think it is an important lesson for us today that as Rich Mattingly used to say, money buys science and science buys lives. And so we need to remember that early on they were focused on science. With that care center network, by 1980, the median survival was now at 18 or so. So it had jumped up fairly rapidly with these things that you very clearly described, but the science was non-existent, absolutely non-existent. And so you're starting to bring in Bob Bell, a hero of the story. Doris and Bob Dressing brought him on, and they brought him on to do something about the science. So what did they do?
Right. So Doris and Bob Dressing hired Bob Bell to lead the science and medicine. And, they were frustrated that very little was known about. Nobody knew what caused this disease. So Bob Bell's idea was to set up research hubs at the top universities around the country and fund them. And just like the care centers focused on CF, these research hubs would focus exclusively on CF science. They, the characteristics of the symptoms of the disease, looking at the disease at the cellular level, the molecular level, the genetic level. And Bob Bell wanted these like intense, foci all around the country. So he started setting up what he called a research development program. And so the first one was at the University of Alabama, and then a couple of them popped up in California. And slowly, it became an incredibly prestigious thing to have one of these research hubs at your university. And funding these amazing research hubs was Doris Tolson and Bob Dressing behind the scenes raising money. So just as quickly as Bob Bell was launching these new science hubs, the two of them were grabbing money, raising money, and throwing it to the science. So within about a decade, he had established about 12 hubs, research hubs around the country, each one with, anywhere between 10 and 20 scientists. And so it's this powerhouse of top high grade scientific research, and just focused on CF, which is amazing if you think about it. I mean, this is a disease that in the US it affects about 30,000 people, and worldwide about 70,000, as far as we know. I mean, we think there are more who haven't been diagnosed, but that's what we know so far. And all these researchers were focusing on this little orphan disease. And these fundraisers were, raising gobs of money. I mean, a lot of money for the time. And, it was an extraordinary effort. In some ways, it's, being a little echoed by the COVID response now, the way the focus is on the research. But, this was going on in the 80s, and it was an extraordinary effort to harvest science.
Bijal, it's so fun to see you get so excited about this. I love it. So, you may have mentioned this, and forgive me, but they had $400,000 in the bank, the CF Foundation,
Right.
when they knew they were going to need to raise $10 million. So they committed to these programs when they only had $400,000. And so Bob Dressing and Doris had to go out and raise the difference.
Yes. So
In order to fund them. There was this dare to dream again type of thing. Let me ask you a quick question. So they did this in 1980. Was it successful? What was the fruit of that?
Well, there were several big successes in the 1980s. So the first one was figuring out, what was the problem with these cells in the body? And there were two teams working on this. On the East Coast, there was Rick Boucher and Mike Knowles at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And on the West Coast was a rather unique scientist named Paul Quinton. And what was so unique about Paul Quinton was he actually has cystic fibrosis. And he is very much alive and kicking today. And both teams made a breakthrough. They figured out that the problem with the cells was that they weren't balancing the salt correctly. They weren't letting salt in and out of the cell the way it was supposed to be in a healthy person. So on the East Coast, Rick Boucher and Mike Knowles, they figured out this in the lungs. They looked at lung cells and they figured out, all right, that's why the lungs are dry and the mucus is thick. It's because salt flow is disrupted and the mucus isn't thin and they can't cough it out, which is why it clogs up the lungs. Now on the West Coast, there's Paul Quinton, who actually is this amazing scientist. He actually dug out chunks of his own skin and tried to figure out why his skin was salty. I mean, he had very salty sweat. And he told me that when he was a little kid, animals used to lick him because, animals like salt and his skin was salty. And so he basically gouged out sweat glands from his own skin, dissected them in the lab, and he figured out that the reason his sweat was so salty was because the sweat glands were not pulling that salt back into the body. They were letting it go. And that's why it all came out on the surface of his skin. So East Coast, they figured out the defect in the lungs. West Coast, they figured out what was going on in the skin. And so that was all by about 1983. So then after that,
let me stop you. Okay, because I think that we probably owe the audience an explanation of breath from salt. And that links in with what you've just described with this defective channel or movement of salt and water into the airway. Can you explain your title to us?
Yeah, well, I'll admit that I went for a more lyrical title because I thought it sounded pretty. But the salt refers to the fact that, even during the Middle Ages, this disease was known about. People used to say, the child whose brow is salty when kissed is hexed or bewitched. So they would kiss the baby's forehead. If it tasted salty, they would assume the child was a witch. So this is a disease that is characterized by salty sweat. And there's almost no other disease known to have this characteristic, this symptom. And so that's the salt part of the title. And the breath part, over the course of this disease, the patients lose lung capacity, and their lungs fill with this mucus, and they can't draw a breath. So this was the victory, as I saw it, of breath over salt. So that's the meaning behind the title. But
well, I'm glad I asked that, because I always assumed that what you meant was that in the airway, it's reversed from the sweat gland. And so you're actually moving chloride and salt, or sodium or salt, into the airway that draws water in. So salt actually liquefies the airways. And so breath from salt, I thought you meant, because when the salt begins to move back into the airways, your breathing is made easier. It's sort of
that
like
works too.
Well, I've got to ask. But
it was more
for those
an
that are trying to figure
emotional.
out what we just said, if you leave oatmeal on the stove too long and you evaporate the water out, it gets very sticky, and that's what happens to. It's not exactly what happens, but it's like that in the CF airway with the mucus secretions. We're running against. We want to be Let's jump to the gene, 1989. Let's briefly tell that story, because that was really the key for opening up the science. So,
Right.
And that's a beautiful story in the book. Tell us about, because that back then, you should probably let people know, finding a gene in 1989 was not like finding a gene today.
Yeah, finding a gene, and take into account that this was before the Genome Project, way before the Genome Project. So we didn't have the instruction manual for building a human, which we do today. We have all 3.2 billion building blocks in the correct order, and we can read it like we could read a book. But back then, we didn't have any of that, and it wasn't easy to read DNA. So beginning in the early 80s, a researcher named Lap Chi Choi, who worked at the Hospital for Sick Kids in Toronto, he began looking for this gene. And so his gene hunt progressed. And then in 1985, Francis Collins, who is now the current director of the National Institutes of Health, he also began looking for the gene. And, this became an international race to find this gene. And, long story short, Lap Chi Choi and Francis Collins teamed up, and they discovered the gene in 1989. And they discovered the mutation that sort of broke that gene. And when a gene is broken, the protein that it's supposed to make is also broken. So when you broke that protein, then the cell could no longer handle salt anymore. And everybody thought that when the gene was found, we were going to solve this disease. Okay, we found the CF gene, easy, let's do gene therapy. Patients have a broken gene, 2 broken genes, let's give them a good copy. But what turned out to be incredibly frustrating, I mean, that sounds great on paper, just give the patients a healthy gene. But getting the gene into the lungs, getting this one piece of DNA into the lungs where it was needed to do its job, that proved all but impossible. So, all this excitement and fervor when the gene was found, and we're going to cure this disease, and everybody thought that if they can cure CF, they're going to cure other diseases exactly the same way. And so when gene therapy failed, it was a big letdown. And that's when Bob Bell decided that, the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation had to go it alone. They had to figure out another way of developing treatments for these sick children. And in 1998, they started on this course. And this is also when Preston joined the foundation. And so Bob Bell and Preston went on together to find a biotech company that was willing to do the crazy thing of trying to fix a broken protein in a cell. And it was really crazy because no pharmaceutical company had ever tried to do anything like that before. And Preston remembers how crazy people thought they were. Right?
Bob and I, knocked on a lot of doors, and most people just quietly ushered us out very quickly, thanked us for coming, but we never heard back from them. We did sign 6 companies up. And when I say the therapeutic development program, which later became known as venture philanthropy, was primarily focused on a new drug discovery method called high throughput screening. And so the difference there, I'll just do this real quick. I wasn't sure if you're going to go over this or not, but basically instead of doing things methodically, 1 or 2 chemicals in the lab of an academic scientist today, high throughput screening used robotics to test thousands of chemicals a day, eventually in CF cells, to see if any of those chemicals that were placed on CF cells fixed the defective CF protein. And if it fixed the CF protein, it would change something, emit light or change the dye color, so that you could see that and you would know that, hey, something interesting is happening here. We really didn't care how it was working. We just wanted to see if it was working. And so that had not been done before to develop it. No drug had been developed using high throughput screening. CF was a membrane-bound protein. No one thought that was possible. Many of our colleagues thought we were crazy, not just the industry folks. But Bob had this brilliant way of bringing industry together. I'm going to let you describe this. Industry together with academia, which I think was just a stunningly brilliant way to sort of begin to solve this therapeutic dilemma in cystic fibrosis.
Yeah, this was really the launch of using venture philanthropy. And basically the idea was that they would fund, the company was called Aurora Biosciences, and later that company was acquired by Vertex Pharmaceuticals. And they basically said, okay, we're going to fund the early stage of this research. We're going to see if you can fix a cell in a dish with some chemical, and we'll pay for that early research. And if you fail, then we lose our money. But in the case where you take this chemical and bring it all the way through and create a drug, you'll give us some royalties back. So it seemed like a great idea, because this was a nutty idea, fixing this one little protein in the cell, making it work right so that the salt moved correctly. And, they didn't have an animal model of cystic fibrosis. A lot of diseases, you make an animal model and you can test the drug in that model before you test it in humans. So Vertex Pharmaceuticals, the chemists there, had to go, they screened, hundreds of thousands of chemicals. They found one that sort of fixed the protein. And then, it wasn't over. It's not that quick. You can't just say, oh, dump a bunch of chemicals on it. The robots will detect which one works, and then you're done. That was a very, very crude molecule. And to get it to the state where it was a drug took, a group of chemists, and the group was between 7 and 20 chemists. And they were building, it was like artisanal chemistry. Think of those really posh cheesemakers. And, these chemists were making one chemical at a time. They took that crude molecule, changed it a bit, tested on cells. Next time, changed a little more, tested it on cells. They made hundreds of thousands of molecules by hand, tested it on cells until they got one that they thought would make a good drug. And this, I met all the scientists that were involved in this, and they were so passionate. They were so, they were so in touch with the CF community. I mean, this was another incredibly moving part for me. They knew the patients. I mean, this was very, very personal. And, when you see these chemists each at their own bench, making these chemicals one by one, testing them, I mean, it's an incredibly emotional experience. And, I think before this, I thought, oh, robots just picked out the right chemical. You don't see the human effort involved until you talk to these scientists. And, that to me was amazing. And it wouldn't have worked without the collaboration of university scientists with the Vertex scientists, because there was lots that the university scientists had figured out, and they had to give that knowledge to Vertex scientists who had never, they hadn't worked on cystic fibrosis. So it was that amazing collaboration, and then usually university scientists, view pharmaceutical industry scientists as the dark side, and the industry thinks of academia as sort of the, not very precise side. But these guys got together, learned to work together, realized their misconceptions about each other, and they developed drugs together. And, now Vertex has developed 4 drugs that treat 90% of the cystic fibrosis population, one molecule at a time. And, that just, to this day, that blows me away.
Yeah, I mean, that is an amazing story. The early days of getting together at Vertex were, first of all, were stunning because of the robotics they had. The first time Bob and I visited Aurora, Vertex, we felt like children in a candy store because we saw all of this going on that would accelerate the science in a way we'd never been able to do before. The academic scientists were skeptical in the beginning, but after about 3 meetings, they were wedded to this. And then upon, I have to mention Paul Negulescu and Fred Van Gore at being as a chemist. There were many wonderful people. Now, I can't go, you went into most of the names in the book, but they were a very dedicated team. And I was glad that you had the picture of the Vertex team in the book as well.
The Vertex team was incredible, and, I could list all those scientists right here, but, there's a beautiful portrait of them in the book. And, I talk about each of their motivations and how they got into the cystic fibrosis project. And, once again, there are power women chemists in that story who are just incredible. So it's just, it's really, that group of scientists just really, really floored me.
Well, they're very good because the other programs that we funded did not succeed. And the likelihood of finding a drug and bringing it to finding a chemical and making it a drug that's FDA approved is at best 1 in 1,000. And so the last compound that was developed has actually 3 drugs in it, right? And so that's the one that gets 90% of people with cystic fibrosis. And so if you think about that, the odds of that happening are 1 in 1,000 times 1 in 1,000 times 1 in 1,000. And so that's, it kind of tells you how remarkable this story is that we were able to do that. And none of this would have happened without the money that was raised from the community. Remember, we talked about Joe raising $250 million. The initial funding of Vertex was $75 million. And all of those payments were milestone payments. So if they were continued to have success, they would be paid. They weren't guaranteed that amount of money. They had up to that amount of money. And that was part of the success. Collaboration was the other part of the success. We also that money we just talked about lowered the risk for industry to get into CF. What Bob Bell came up with was really a brilliant method to lure industry into the field of cystic fibrosis. Tell me, you've talked to a lot of people we've talked about these drugs that were approved in 2012, 15, 17, 19. We've gone from 4% to 90%. What does this mean? What are these drugs? We're not done yet. I have to say very quickly, we're not done until it's 100%. But for those that have benefited, what's your impression of what these drugs mean for them?
The drugs have completely changed their lives. You went from children on, just one infection away from death or malnutrition. And, I can barely recognize some of these children that I saw when I was reporting the Discover story. And now they're, I'm a short person, so it's not hard to be taller than me, but now they're a full head taller than me. They look robust, they look healthy, there's color in their face. And, these people, the children who got it when they were reasonably young, they're going to have a full life. They will not die from cystic fibrosis. They will die from something that, kills the rest of us, or old age. They're going to have full lives. They'll have full families. And it's extraordinary. I mean, it is truly the gift of life. It's the gift of breath. And it's amazing. And now I think that children who are born with this disease, if they receive treatments early enough, as they are starting to, they may never experience most of the symptoms that we associate with cystic fibrosis. So in a way, it's, it will be in their genome, the mutation will be in their cell, but they won't manifest the symptoms. I mean, at least that is the hope. It's probably too early to say that for sure, but it's a life changer, and not just for the patient, but for the families that would spend, up to 6-7 hours a day looking after their sick child and treating them and doing all the physiotherapy that was needed. So it's huge. I should say that I'm seeing a lot of names of scientists in the chat, and I just want you to all know that I haven't mentioned them here, but they're all in the book, all the members of the gene hunting team, all the scientists at Vertex who are part of this. So I couldn't spit them all out at you now, but they are in the book. They're given their dues.
I'm not reading the chat yet because I'll get motion sickness if I do. So I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But, if we mentioned that we're not done. Last year, the CF team, the CF community announced the Path to the Cure initiative. That was a $500 million initiative. It just is probably the beginning. They'll do much more than that, I bet, before it's all over with. And that was to make sure we move that 90% to 100%. There's a lot of reasons to think we can be successful with that. And then ultimately, the dream is for everyone with cystic fibrosis to be able to say, I used to have cystic fibrosis. What was the community's impression of that initiative when it was announced?
I think people believe in this initiative. I mean, we've seen what the foundation has achieved so far in taking care of 90% of patients, and the strategies and the science going forward, I think, are possibly, I don't know if this is even possible to say, it's even more exciting. I mean, they are looking into such cutting edge therapies for actually curing this disease, that I have no doubt that they're going to get there. And I think a lot of the community has faith in it too. I mean, these 10% who are remaining, they have mutations that can't be fixed with Vertex's drugs. And that's devastating for those families. But I think what's so exciting is that the pledge from the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation that those people aren't going to be left behind. And there is a mega effort underway to find treatments for those patients and to find ways of treating the disease that, they're not just going to work for cystic fibrosis. I think the technologies that the foundation helps fund the development of, I think those are going to work for several types of orphan diseases and other diseases in general. So it's a pretty exciting time.
So I'm going to encourage folks to send in questions, and I will start focusing on the chat chat box now. I have a couple more questions for you, Bijal, so there's time for them to submit questions that you can answer. How has this story, Bijal, and all the work that you've put into it changed you? And what did you not expect?
You know, as a science journalist, you know, I've always, before starting this book, I had always focused on the science, and it was, you know, in some ways it was a bit dry. And I've just seen such a level of collaboration here that, you know, I have hope not just for curing CF, but I think there's hope for a lot of other diseases. The innovative way that venture philanthropy funded the research for these cures, these treatments, I think it's very, very inspiring. And so I don't know, I come off as more optimistic after this whole 8-year journey. And, you know, it's so exciting to me that, you know, I'm going to keep covering it. You know, and I just think, you know, just the ability for people to join together, to come together for a common cause, that's really inspiring. And when people aren't arguing over the credit, it's amazing what can get done.
So cystic fibrosis has become a model for many other orphan diseases. And a lot of people at the foundation spend time with them, helping them move their efforts forward. Is there a bigger story for, you know, we're in this very divided, you know, world right now, it seems. Everybody's on one side of the fence or the other. Is there a broader story that the CF community brings out that is a lesson that you would want people to hear from your book? I apologize if I'm asking a political-ish question unannounced to you.
I think, you know, people need to just drop their preconceptions and you know, all these parents, I mean, these parents, these scientists, these philanthropists were from all these different worlds, and they all came together for a common cause. And I can see that, you know, a similar effort today with COVID. But, you know, one thing that we didn't touch on was how much the cystic fibrosis community, you know, they worked for those treatments. The patients actually were really invested in them. And the cystic fibrosis community really inspired the participation of patients in the research. And that's why they were able to get their treatments. They participated in clinical trials. And I think we can take a page from the CF model and say, okay, you know, we're whining about not having a COVID vaccine right now. Everybody should take part in clinical trials for the greater good. And, you know, the greater good is that, you know, we'll get a vaccine quicker. So I think, you know, just coming together and making participation in clinical trials sort of, I mean, that to me is a very patriotic act. If you know, say, I'm willing to take that, you know, experimental vaccine and, you know, for the better, you know, for the greater good. And I think that's something that, you know, the CF Foundation really, you know, they devoted a lot of time to. And the patients are real heroes because they were the ones that participated in those trials. If they didn't do it, they wouldn't have a treatment. So I think we can all learn from that.
So many heroes. Well, Bijal, congratulations on a fabulous book, Breath from Salt. I've never done this before, but I think I'm seeing a little blue tab there. If you don't have a copy, you can click that tab to purchase a copy. And it looks like you may even get 10% off.
You type in the event code.
So congratulations, and thank you for highlighting this wonderful story of cystic fibrosis. So I'm going to look at the chat. I see that there's one question, perfect for you. You know, is cystic fibrosis a model for personalized medicine going forward? And has it changed drug discovery for other rare diseases?
I think, you know, it's a little early to say, but, you know, cystic fibrosis is definitely marks the beginning of precision medicine, of personalized medicine. because the way Vertex scientists did this was they went sort of mutation type by mutation type. And, you know, the drugs were designed for patients with one type of mutation, a second type of mutation, and it was personalized. It was precision medicine. And I think that that is going to inform other diseases. And, but it's not just that, it's the fact that, you know, the way the science was done, the collaborative style of the science, I think is a great model for other orphan diseases, and how to start up a registry for patients, how to amass knowledge, a critical mass of knowledge about each disease. There's so much that can be learned from the foundation model. You know, I think and there are many diseases that will benefit, not just orphan diseases.
We're out of time, I think. But
Okay.
let me thank you, Bijal. Just a terrific job. I know that I speak for everybody who's listening. Thank you very much for all that you've done for the CF community. And thank you to Barbara's Bookstore for hosting this event for us tonight. I hope that it's been meaningful for everyone. And you've learned a lot from Bijal. And it's a great book. I encourage you to get it and learn about this amazing story that's really been made possible by the CF community, the most amazing community. It'll give you hope. It'll give you hope that we can do anything that we come up against. So thank you all. Bijal, do you want to have the last word?
Thank you all for listening and for joining us for this event. And, you know, I hope we piqued your curiosity, not just about this disease, but about all the stories behind this disease. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Bijal. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And thank
Have
you,
a good
Barbara.
evening.
Yeah, bye-bye. I don't know how to turn this off.
I don't know either.